Okay, deep breath after all that stuff, estimating the heritability. As I said, you don't necessarily need to know that, but I think it helps to get some idea of the mechanisms of what's actually going on here. And as I said, I'm not here to rubbish behavioural genetics at all, because it is an extremely important way of trying to determine the relative contribution of genes to the environment, using twin studies, as we just saw, but also adoption studies, which is another way of doing it. It's really the only way we have of trying to determine the extent to which a trait or an illness or a disorder might have some kind of genetic basis. But let's look at some of the problems with this. This is a lovely thing by Richard Lewontin, who's a geneticist, who points out one of the big problems. This is from the 1970s, big problems with behavioural genetics. Stay with me, I'm going to talk about plants, but I hope to come back to humans. So let's look at what's going on here. What he asked us to do is to imagine that we have a bunch of seeds. We have a packet of seeds. We go down to the seed shop, the garden centre, and buy a normal packet of seeds. Now all those seeds will be different genetically, because they're the result of normal fertilisation. They're not cloned, they're just basically like human individuals, they're genetically different. We get those seeds and we give it a good old mix up, and then we take half of the seeds and we put each half into one of two planters. So we have a little planter here, we put the plants in, and we put the planter seeds in this other planter here. Both of them are given the same lighting, but the one on the left are given good nutrient solutions, and the other ones on the right are given deficient nutrient solutions. Now, we can see that there's immediately a difference in the environment between these two groups. Now, let's just imagine we're interested in asking a question. We say, well, to what extent is the height of a plant determined by genes, and to what extent is the height of a plant determined by the environment? Now, the answer to that question depends on where we look. So let's just say we decide to examine this bunch of individuals here, and we want to know why this plant here on the left is taller than the one next to it. Okay. Now we know that the environment here is identical. Okay. This is a thought experiment, so no quibbling about that. It is identical. So the only possible source of variation among these different plants is the genetic one. Okay. So if we just look at this particular environment, we will come away concluding that genes are 100% determining of plant height. And if we looked at this environment, we would come to exactly the same conclusion. We would say the fact that this plant here is taller than these two plants here is nothing to do with the environment, because the environment's the same. So again, more corroborative evidence here that height is totally 100% genetic and the environment plays no role in this at all. However, if we were to compare the average height of the plants on the left with the average height of the plants on the right, we would find out that the average height on the plants on the left is bigger than the average height of the plants on the right, as I'm sure you can see. And we said, well, where does that difference come from? What accounts for that difference? Well, the answer is it is entirely environmental, because remember, we randomly mix the seeds up, so it's very unlikely to be any net genetic difference between the two groups. What is different? The environment. So this plant bigger than this plant is genetic, this plant bigger than this plant is genetic, but the average height of these compared to the average height of these is 100% environmental. What does this mean for people? Well, we can imagine, just for example, if we were interested in, I don't know, something like heart disease, for example, if we were to do the same thing, we look at this particular sample of people, all from a good environment, and ask why this person is let's just say, less likely to have heart disease than this person, then we would conclude that it was due to genetic reasons. There is no environment at all, no environmental effect at all. Similarly, if we looked at a bunch of poor people in a poor environment, so maybe these are more deprived individuals living in a rough part of town with less access to healthcare, we might conclude again that in that particular sample, heart disease is entirely genetic. So what might we conclude then? Well, policymakers looking at this research might say, well, actually there's absolutely no point in putting in place any interventions, any health promotion materials, any of this kind of stuff, because we've already found that the environment makes no difference to your health of your heart or whatever else it happens to be, diabetes, schizophrenia, whatever. However, by focusing on looking in a very specific place, we're not recognizing that, yes, the reason why one poor person is more likely to have heart disease or cancer than another is genes. The reason why one rich person, let's say, is more likely to have heart disease or less cancer than another is genes. But when we look at the difference between the two groups, we see a massive environmental effect. So actually, in this case, you would conclude that interventions do make a difference, but what the difference they make is between the two groups, the environmental qualities of the group. So there is, in here, a very strong justification for targeting certain areas of the population. Just to summarise that. So that's really important. I think if you remember one thing about this entire screencast, is trying to get your head around this, because this is incredibly important. And it gets, and this is just some explanation of that to do with that I've already just said. So this is just there for you to remind you of it when you see the slides. Here's another one. Turkheimer again, who's just done tons of research on this stuff. He did a study in 2003 on several hundred identical and non-identical twins. And what he found is that if you looked at, I think it was educational achievement, IQ, things like that he was looking at. If you looked at poor kids, so kids from poor schools, when you initially did the study and looked at the twins as a whole, let's start at that, you found a moderate genetic effect. Okay? And that might conclude that genes account maybe for 30% of the variation, 40% or whatever it happened to be. It doesn't really matter, but there was a moderate effect of genes on this particular trait. But actually then what you did is if you broke it down into two groups by virtue of quality of life, so basically the posh schools versus the rough schools, essentially, then what you found out was that for poor kids, the environment had a massive effect on their IQ. 60% of their environment, their performance was accountable by the environmental differences between the kids, whereas genes had practically no effect. For well-off kids, it was the opposite effect. Genes were showing a substantial effect, whereas the environment was showing a very small effect. It's worth trying to get your head around this, reading the slide, reading about this, because it is an important point. You might want to reflect on that, pause the thing and reflect on why it might be. Genes matter more in good schools, environment matters more in poor schools. My take on this, and it is only my take, is that one possible explanation for this is that the difference in the environment between each of the individual kids who's going to the good schools might be relatively small. In other words, let's just think about the poor kids for a minute. A small difference in the environment for relatively poor kids might have a big effect on their performance. So, for example, simply having, a book versus no books could have a dramatic effect on your performance at school. Having a quiet place to study versus having a no quiet place to study. Not a massive difference in the great scheme of things, but might have a dramatic effect. So if the kids in the poor schools have got the opportunity to do school work for an hour a day, or maybe the class, some classes are quite rowdy and some classes are a little bit less rowdy, these might have dramatic effects on the poor kids, because a small difference in the environment when you've got nothing can have a big effect on you. Okay, so, the difference between having no food and a small amount of food is actually a dramatic effect. On the other hand, if we go to the very rich kids, then the environments are already probably pretty amazing, you might imagine. They'll have all the books they want, they might have private tutors, they might, they'll have their own rooms where they can study, access to libraries, the internet, whatever you want. So small differences among these rich kids might have very little effect. It makes not much difference, the difference between having, 70 books and 80 books, but it makes a lot of difference makes a lot of difference when you're having the difference between no books and 10 books, say. So when you've got a super optimized environment, it could be that the environmental differences aren't important. So what then matters more is how genetically, quote unquote, intelligent the kids are, because the environment is already super optimized. For the poor kids, there's so much extra environmental benefit that could be had from having small differences, these massively overwhelm the genetic effects, so they're not seen at all. Another way of thinking about it is that if you imagine a bunch of elite athletes, all who've got super optimized training programs with nutritionists, sports psychologists, physiologists, people who are writing training programs, nutritionists, they've got heart rate monitors and all kinds of fancy measuring equipment. The environmental differences in these people might make very little difference. It might make a few milliseconds difference or something like that, but a small difference. Whereas if you've got a bunch of non-athletes, then actually what probably makes a big difference is how much each individual goes running. So if somebody doesn't go running at all, or somebody goes running once a week, that 1 hour running a week might have a dramatic effect on the ability of that person to win a race. Whereas when you've already doing all the training, then what comes out then is the genetic effects. So it's worth bearing these things in mind. And how this relates to illness is extremely important, because depending on how you do the sample, just like with the plants, it might be that the health of very wealthy people who live in good environments, with healthy environments, access to healthcare, fresh water, etc., the differences between their well-being might be largely due to differences in their genes, because the environment is already good. Whereas if you live in a poor environment without a lot of these benefits, then what really matters is very small differences in the environment might be leading to these extra effects. So it's important to know who we're dealing with when we're doing these behavioural genetics effects. There are also a bunch of gene-environment interactions. What this means is that genes themselves can affect the environment in different ways. This is where it gets even more muddy. So basically, passive gene-environment interactions. Parents, if the biological parents give their kids, each parent gives their kids half of their genes. That means that if a parent is intelligent, the likelihood is that the child is going to be intelligent. If the parent is aggressive, then for no other reason apart from the genetic one, there's a likelihood that the child is going to be aggressive, just in terms of, we know that aggression is heritable. But parents also, if they're living with the kids, will create an environment. So aggressive parents give kids aggressive genes on average, but they may also provide an aggressive environment for them, an environment in which shouting and physical violence might be commonplace. This is a so-called cycle of abuse. So parents are giving two things to the parents, both their genes and the environment. So these two things interact. Active gene-environment interactions is where individuals with certain traits will tend to create or select their own environment. So kids who are extroverted will probably tend to want to hang out with extroverted kids. And this hanging out with extroverted kids becomes part of their environment, which influences them. So, a smart kid, let's say, who's inherited a bunch of genes which predispose him to smartness, might want to start hanging out with other smart kids who form a geek club, and then this geek club is the environment that this individual is in, which it ramps up the intelligence. See, so we have both an intelligent environment selected by the kids, and we have an intelligent genes. And the final one is evocative. This is called evocative because the individual evokes certain responses in other individuals. So kids that are shy will be treated differently to kids that are bold. And so people's responses to shy kids, again, is part of their environment. There's a lovely study done a number of years ago in psychology, and I can't remember the actual reference for it, where essentially somebody walked into a room and people were either attractive, the participants were either attractive or less attractive. Right? They walked into the room and the experimenter said, can you just please sit in that chair, I'll be back in a few minutes, and then cleared off. The dependent variable of this study, the thing you were measuring, was basically how long the individual sat there waiting for the experimenter to come back before they eventually gave up and left. Was it the attractive people, you think, who stayed there longer? Was it the less attractive people who stayed there longer? Or was there no difference? Pause it, think about it. Answer, the attractive people stayed far less time. Why? Very probably because they were used to people, because they're attractive people, they're probably used to people kind of bowing and scraping to them, and whereas the less attractive people were less used to that. So the attractive